Story number 1. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled deep in the forest, there lived a family of 3, a husband, a wife, and their young daughter. They were happy and content with their simple lives, until one day, a strange man came to their doorstep. The man was tall and thin, with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through them. He claimed to be a traveler, lost and in need of shelter for the night. The family, being kind-hearted, took him in and offered him a meal and a place to sleep. As the night wore on, the man's behavior became increasingly strange. He would mutter to himself in a language the family couldn't understand and stare at them with a sinister grin. The husband and wife grew uneasy, but didn't want to offend their guest. In the middle of the night, the daughter woke up to the sound of whispering. She saw the stranger standing over her parents' bed, holding a knife. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man turned to her and grinned, revealing a mouth full of sharp teeth. The family tried to escape, but the man seemed to be everywhere at once, blocking their path and laughing maniacally. They ran through the forest, but the trees seemed to twist and turn, leading them back to the man. Finally, they came across a clearing with an old abandoned mansion in the center. The family entered the mansion, hoping to find refuge, but soon discovered that they were not alone. The mansion was filled with the ghosts of its former occupants, who had been brutally murdered by the same man who was now chasing them. The ghosts whispered warnings to the family, telling them to run and never look back, but it was too late. The man caught up to them and revealed his true form, a demon from the depths of hell, with the power to control the forest and the spirits within it. The family tried to fight back, but they were no match for the demon's strength and dark magic. The demon dragged the family down into the depths of the mansion, where he trapped them for all eternity. Their screams echoed through the halls, and their faces became etched into the walls, a warning to all who dared to enter. From that day on, the mansion became known as the House of Horrors, and no one dared to venture near it. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the family's screams echoing through the forest, a reminder of the terror that once lurked within. Story number 2. Once upon a time, there was a small town in the countryside that was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a cat. The locals had reported seeing a ghostly feline wandering around the streets, and strange meowing sounds could be heard late at night. As time passed, the sightings became more frequent, and the townsfolk became increasingly unnerved by the spectral cat. Some even claimed to have seen the ghostly figure staring at them through their windows at night. Despite the rumors, most people in the town went about their daily business as usual, believing the ghostly cat to be nothing more than a myth. However, one day, a young couple moved into a house on the outskirts of the town, unaware of the ghostly presence that haunted the area. Soon after they settled in, strange things began to happen. Their belongings would be moved around, and they would hear the sound of tiny paws running across the floor at night. The couple would often find scratches on their furniture and walls, as if something had been clawing at them. At first, they brushed it off as mere coincidence, but as the weeks went by, the occurrences became more frequent and more sinister. They started to feel like they were being watched, and they would often catch glimpses of a shadowy figure darting around the corners of their eyes. One night, the couple woke up to find their bedroom filled with a thick fog. They heard the sound of meowing, and when they turned on the lights, they saw a ghostly cat sitting at the end of their bed, its eyes glowing red. They tried to run out of the room, but the door wouldn't budge. The cat stared at them, and suddenly, the fog cleared, and the ghostly feline disappeared. From that night on, the couple were tormented by the ghostly cat. They would often wake up to find it sitting at the end of their bed, and they would feel its icy breath on their faces. They tried to leave the house, but the ghostly feline followed them wherever they went. In the end, the couple were driven insane by the relentless haunting of the ghostly cat. They were never seen again, and to this day, locals still report sightings of the spectral feline wandering the streets of the small town. Story number 3. Once upon a time, there was a small village nestled deep in the woods. It was a peaceful place where everyone knew each other and lived in harmony. But one day, a strange man came to the village. He was tall and thin, with a pale complexion and dark, sunken eyes. He wore a long, black cloak and carried a silver cane. The man claimed to be a doctor and offered his services to the villagers. At first, they welcomed him with open arms, grateful for his medical expertise. But as time went on, strange things began to happen in the village. People started disappearing without a trace, and those who fell ill under the man's care never seemed to recover. One night, a group of villagers decided to investigate the doctor's true intentions. They snuck into his house and discovered a secret laboratory filled with jars of strange, glowing liquid and mysterious instruments. As they searched the lab, they found a diary belonging to the doctor. The diary revealed the truth about the man's identity. He was not a doctor at all, but a mad scientist who had been experimenting on the villagers. He had been using them as test subjects for his twisted experiments, injecting them with his strange liquids and observing the effects. The villagers were horrified and decided to confront the doctor. But when they arrived at his house, he was nowhere to be found. They searched the woods and eventually stumbled upon a hidden underground laboratory where the doctor was conducting his most heinous experiments yet. The villagers confronted the doctor, and a fierce battle ensued. In the chaos, the laboratory caught fire, and the entire underground complex was destroyed. The doctor was presumed dead, but some say he still haunts the woods to this day, seeking new test subjects for his twisted experiments. From that day on, the village was never the same. The memory of the mad scientist lingered, and the villagers could never shake off the feeling that something sinister still lurked in the woods. Story number 4. Once there was a girl named Emily who had a best friend named Sarah. They had been friends since childhood and did everything together. Emily had no idea that Sarah was leading a double life as a killer. Sarah had been struggling with mental health issues for years, and one day, she snapped. She began killing people she deemed unworthy of living, believing she was doing the world a favor by ridding it of undesirables. Emily started to notice strange behavior from Sarah. She would disappear for long periods of time without explanation, and would sometimes come back covered in blood. Emily tried to confront her about it, but Sarah would always come up with an excuse or change the subject. As time went on, the murders became more frequent, and Emily began to suspect that Sarah was involved. She started to investigate on her own and eventually stumbled upon a room in Sarah's house that was filled with evidence of the murders. Emily was horrified and didn't know what to do. She couldn't turn in her best friend, but she also couldn't let her continue killing innocent people. Sarah started to suspect that Emily knew about her secret and began to turn on her. One day, Sarah lured Emily to an isolated location and revealed her true nature. Emily tried to run, but Sarah was too fast. She chased Emily through the woods, taunting her all the while. Eventually, Emily stumbled and fell, and Sarah caught up to her. As Emily lay on the ground, Sarah stood over her with a knife in her hand. She looked down at Emily with cold, dead eyes and raised the knife to strike. Emily closed her eyes, waiting for the final blow, but it never came. When she opened her eyes, Sarah was gone, and Emily was alone in the woods, surrounded by darkness. Emily never spoke of that night again, but she was never the same. She lived the rest of her life in fear, always looking over her shoulder, wondering if Sarah would come back to finish what she started. Story number 5. Once upon a time, there was an old psychiatric hospital that stood on the outskirts of a small English town. It had been in operation for over a century, and the locals whispered tales of madness and despair that lurked within its walls. The hospital had fallen into disrepair over the years, and its patients were neglected and mistreated. The doctors were overworked and underpaid, and many of them had become just as unhinged as their charges. One night, a fierce storm rolled into town, and the power went out in the hospital. The patients were left in darkness, their screams and cries echoing down the empty hallways. As the storm raged on, strange things began to happen. Patients disappeared without a trace, and their blood-curdling screams could be heard coming from the bowels of the hospital. Rumors spread that the hospital was haunted by the ghosts of its tormented patients, and that the doctors had made dark pacts with malevolent forces to keep their secrets hidden. One by one, the staff and patients succumbed to the madness that permeated the hospital. Some were found dead, their bodies twisted and mangled beyond recognition. Others simply vanished, leaving behind only a sense of dread and foreboding. As the years passed, the hospital fell into disuse, and it became a place of legend and terror. Locals whispered stories of the horrors that had taken place within its walls, and the hospital was left to rot and decay, a monument to the darkness that had once consumed it. Story number 6. It was a dark and stormy night, and Sarah was driving home from a late shift at the diner. As she drove down the deserted country road, she saw a figure in the distance. As she got closer, she realized it was a clown standing by the side of the road, holding a bunch of balloons. Despite feeling uneasy, Sarah pulled over to offer the clown a ride. After all, it was pouring rain, and she didn't want to leave the clown stranded in the middle of nowhere. As the clown climbed into the passenger seat, Sarah couldn't help but notice how unnerving his makeup looked under the streetlights. His eyes seemed to follow her every move, and his smile was a little too wide. But she brushed it off and began driving towards his destination. Little did she know, the clown had a sinister plan for her. As they drove down the dark and winding road, Sarah realized they were no longer on the path towards town. The clown had somehow taken control of the car and was driving them deeper into the woods. Terrified and trapped, Sarah pleaded with the clown to let her go, but all he did was laugh maniacally and reveal a large, sharp knife. She knew then that her fate was sealed, and the clown had lured her into a deadly trap. And so, Sarah became another victim of the infamous clown killer who roamed the countryside, preying on unsuspecting motorists who stopped to offer him a ride. Story number 7. In the small village of Ravenwood, nestled deep in the mountains, there lived a demon known as the Devourer. This creature was said to sneak into homes in the dead of night and feast on the souls of the sleeping residents. No one knew where the demon came from or why it had chosen Ravenwood as its hunting ground. But one thing was for certain: everyone lived in fear of the Devourer's wrath. The villagers tried everything to protect themselves from the demon's attacks. They would hang crosses above their doors, burn sage, and perform rituals to ward off evil spirits. But nothing seemed to work. The Devourer would always find a way to slip past their defenses and claim its next victim. One fateful night, a young couple, James and Emily, had just fallen asleep when they heard a creaking sound outside their bedroom door. They assumed it was just the wind, so they rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But then they heard it again, louder this time. The couple sat up in bed, their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the couple found themselves face to face with the devourer. Its eyes glowed a menacing red as it towered over them, its razor-sharp teeth glistening in the dim moonlight. The couple tried to scream, but their throats were paralyzed with fear. The demon let out a deep, guttural laugh before lunging at them. They felt its cold breath on their faces as it opened its mouth wide and prepared to devour their souls. But just as it was about to strike, a bright light filled the room. A group of holy men had heard of the demon's rampage and had come to exorcise it. With a powerful prayer, they banished the devourer back to the depths of hell, never to be seen again. The couple was left shaken and traumatized, but grateful to be alive. From that day on, they slept with one eye open, always wary of what horrors might be lurking in the shadows. They had survived the devourer's attack, but they knew that there were many other demons out there, waiting to claim their souls. Story number 8. Deep in the heart of the forest lay a small town, its people living peaceful lives amidst the quiet rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. However, that peace was shattered when a psychopathic killer arrived in town. The killer was a master of disguise, and no one knew his true identity. He would sneak into people's homes at night, waiting until they were asleep before making his move. He would then brutally murder his victims with a variety of weapons, leaving their bodies mutilated and disfigured. As the killings continued, the townspeople grew more and more afraid. They locked their doors at night and avoided going out after dark. But the killer was cunning and always seemed to be one step ahead of the police. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the killer continued to wreak havoc on the town, his attacks growing more and more frequent. Panic gripped the people, and rumors began to spread that the killer was actually a supernatural being sent to punish them for their sins. One day, a group of teenagers decided to go camping in the woods. As they set up their tents and started a fire, they had no idea that the killer was watching them from the shadows. As night fell, the killer struck, creeping silently into their campsite. One by one, he killed the unsuspecting teenagers, leaving their bodies scattered throughout the woods. The next day, when the police arrived at the campsite, they found only carnage and chaos. The killer had vanished into the night, leaving the town gripped by fear. The weeks and months passed, but the killer was never caught. The town's once idyllic streets were now empty and dark, and the few remaining residents lived in constant fear of the killer's next attack. One day, a young woman was walking through the woods when she stumbled upon an old cabin. As she cautiously approached the door, she heard a strange sound coming from inside. She called out, but there was no response. Slowly, she pushed the door open, her heart racing with fear. Inside, she found a room filled with knives, chains, and other tools of torture. But what frightened her most was the sight of a strange figure, dressed in black, standing in the corner of the room. As she backed away, the figure suddenly lunged at her, but she managed to escape and run for her life. When she reached the town, she told the police what she had seen, and they finally had a lead on the killer's whereabouts. They quickly organized a search party, and after a long and dangerous journey through the woods, they finally found the cabin. Inside, they found the killer sitting in a chair with a blank expression on his face. When they arrested him, they found that he had been living in the cabin for months, surviving on stolen food and water. He had become completely unhinged, driven mad by the fear and paranoia that had consumed him. The killer was taken away, but the town never fully recovered from the horror he had inflicted upon them. To this day, people still speak in hushed tones of the killer in the woods, and many are afraid to venture into the forest after dark, for fear that he may still be lurking in the shadows. Story number 9. In the small mountain town of Blackwood, there was a family who had lived there for generations. They were known to be reclusive and secretive, but what most people didn't know was that they practiced dark magic in secret. They were devotees of a dark lord, whom they worshipped in secret. The family had a young daughter named Emily, who was only 10 years old. She was a bright and curious girl, but her family saw her as nothing more than a vessel for their dark lord. They had been preparing her for this role since she was born. One fateful night, the family decided that it was time for Emily to become the next sacrifice. They dragged her into their basement and began the dark ritual. They chanted in ancient tongues and drew symbols on the floor with blood. But as they continued the ritual, something went terribly wrong. A powerful energy surged through the room, and Emily began to convulse and scream. The family watched in horror as the girl's body contorted and twisted, her eyes turning pitch black. She rose into the air, levitating above the ground, and began to speak in a voice that was not her own. It was the voice of the Dark Lord they had been summoning all these years. The possessed Emily turned on her family, tearing them apart with ease. The townspeople could hear the screams and cries from the family's home, but when they arrived, they found only blood and carnage. Emily was nowhere to be found. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen in Blackwood. The sky turned dark, and storms raged without warning. Animals went missing, and people reported hearing strange noises coming from the mountains. It was as if the town was cursed. To this day, the townspeople swear that they can hear Emily's laughter echoing through the mountains on dark and stormy nights. They say that if you're ever hiking in the mountains and you hear her laughter, you should turn back and run as fast as you can, because if she catches you, She'll take you to the family's basement, and you'll become the next sacrifice in their never-ending quest for power. And no one knows what horrors await those who are sacrificed to the Dark Lord. Story number 10. There was a world where the sun never rose, and darkness enveloped everything. The people who lived there had never known anything different, and they had learned to adapt to the darkness. They created their own sources of light, using candles, lanterns, and even fireflies to navigate through their world. However, there was one place in this world where the darkness was particularly strong. It was a dense forest that stretched for miles, with towering trees that blocked out what little light there was. Few dared to venture into the forest, as strange things were said to happen there. One day, a group of brave adventurers decided to explore the forest. They traveled deep into the heart of the forest, where the darkness was at its thickest. As they moved deeper into the shadows, they began to hear strange whispers and eerie laughter. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet felt like it was alive. Suddenly, the adventurers saw a faint light in the distance. They cautiously made their way towards it, and soon they saw a strange figure standing in the glow of a single, flickering candle. The figure beckoned them closer, and they saw that it was a gaunt, ghostly creature with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch forever. The creature spoke to them in a voice that was barely a whisper, telling them of the darkness that surrounded them and the eternal night that had consumed their world. It warned them that the darkness would swallow them whole, and they would never be seen again. As the adventurers turned to leave, they realized that the candle had gone out, leaving them in complete darkness. They stumbled blindly through the forest, desperately searching for a way out. But the darkness had become so thick that they couldn't even see their own hands in front of their faces. In the end, the adventurers were never seen again. Some say they were consumed by the darkness, while others believe they were taken by the ghostly creature in the forest. And to this day, the forest remains a place of fear and terror, where the darkness reigns supreme and the sun never rises. Story number 11. In the heart of the dense forests of Ravenwood, there stood an old, abandoned mansion that had been shrouded in mystery for generations. The locals whispered tales of the mansion's dark history and how it had been cursed by an evil spirit that had taken residence within its walls. The mansion had been built by a wealthy family who had moved to Ravenwood from the city, seeking a quieter life away from the hustle and bustle of urban living. But soon after they had settled in, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small things like doors that would open and close on their own, and strange noises that would echo through the halls at night. But as time passed, the family began to notice more disturbing occurrences. They would hear the sound of someone whispering in their ear when they were alone in a room, and would catch glimpses of shadowy figures moving about in the corners of their vision. The youngest daughter, a sweet and innocent child, began to have nightmares of a ghostly woman with long black hair and a tattered white gown who would whisper to her in the dead of night. The family tried to leave the mansion, but found that the doors and windows had all been sealed shut. They were trapped inside with the malevolent spirit that had taken hold of the mansion, and there seemed to be no way out. As time passed, the family began to succumb to the madness that had taken hold of them. The father would sit for hours staring blankly at the walls, while the mother would mutter to herself and rock back and forth in her chair. The eldest son, once a strong and healthy young man, had become weak and frail, unable to even lift a fork to his mouth. And the youngest daughter, no one knew what had become of her. Some said she had been taken by the ghostly woman in white, while others claimed she had simply disappeared without a trace. As the years passed, the mansion became a place of legend, and tales of the family who had been driven to madness by the evil spirit that had taken residence within its walls were passed down from generation to generation. And then, one Halloween night, a group of curious teenagers decided to explore the mansion for themselves. They had heard the stories, of course, but they believed them to be nothing more than fanciful tales designed to scare children. As they approached the gates, they saw a figure watching them from the upper window. It was a pale, gaunt woman with long black hair and a ghostly white gown. The teens brushed off their fears and entered the mansion. At first, everything seemed normal, but as they delved deeper into the mansion, they began to feel a sense of dread. Strange noises echoed through the halls, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream. One of the teens had disappeared, and the others were now trapped in the mansion. They tried to escape, but the doors and windows were all sealed shut. As the night wore on, the remaining teens were tormented by visions of the mansion's dark past. They saw the family that had once lived there, driven to madness by the mansion's curse. They saw the ghostly figures that roamed the halls, seeking vengeance on anyone who dared to enter their domain. One by one, the teens began to disappear. Some were found dead, their bodies twisted and contorted in ways that defied explanation. Others were never seen again. In the end, only one teen managed to escape the mansion, but he was never the same. He spoke of horrors that no one could imagine, and was haunted by the memories of that terrible night for the rest of his days. And to this day, the mansion remains a place of terror and mystery, standing as a testament to the evil that lurks in the darkest corners of the world. Some say that the spirits of the family that once lived there still haunt the mansion, while others claim that the evil spirit that cursed the mansion still waits within its walls, hungry for new victims to torment and claim as its own. Despite the warnings and tales of terror that surround the mansion, there are still those who are drawn to it. Some are thrill seekers, seeking to test their courage and bravery against the mansion's curse, while others are drawn by the whispers of the spirits that still call the mansion home. But no matter their reasons for entering the mansion, none have ever returned to tell the tale. For the mansion of Ravenwood is a place of darkness and horror, a place where the line between the living and the dead is blurred, and where the evil that dwells within is always hungry for new victims. Story number 12. It was a dark and stormy night, and the tiny town of Pine Creek was in the midst of a fierce thunderstorm. The wind was howling like a pack of wolves, and the rain was pounding against the windows like an angry drum. The streets were deserted, and the only sound that could be heard was the distant rumble of thunder. Jenny lay huddled under her blankets, shivering with fear. She had always been afraid of storms, but this one was different. There was an eerie feeling in the air, and she could sense that something was not right. As she tried to calm herself down, she heard a strange noise coming from the closet. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder and more persistent. Slowly, she got out of bed and tiptoed towards the closet, her heart pounding in her chest. As she opened the door, a gust of wind blew into the room, and the closet shook violently. Jenny gasped as she saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at her from the darkness. She stumbled backwards, tripping over her own feet and falling to the ground. The eyes advanced towards her, and she could hear the sound of heavy breathing. She tried to scream, but no sound came out of her mouth. She was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the eyes disappeared, and the closet door slammed shut. Jenny was alone in her room again, but she knew that something had been there with her, something evil. For the next few weeks, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. She would often hear strange noises in the middle of the night, and sometimes she would see a dark figure lurking in the shadows. One night, as she was walking home from a friend's house, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but no one was there. The footsteps grew louder and faster, and she started to run. But no matter how fast she ran, the footsteps seemed to be getting closer and closer. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed and turned around, but there was no one there. She ran home as fast as she could and locked the door behind her. The next day, Jenny went to the local library to research what she had experienced. She discovered that Pine Creek had a dark history, and that there had been several unexplained disappearances over the years. As she delved deeper, she learned about a legend of a dark and malevolent entity that had haunted the town for centuries. It was said to have the power to possess the bodies of its victims and to manipulate their minds, driving them to madness and despair. Jenny realized that she was in grave danger, and she knew that she had to find a way to protect herself. She sought out the help of a local historian who had written extensively about the town's dark past. Together, they uncovered an ancient ritual that was said to banish the evil entity back to the underworld. They gathered the necessary items and performed the ritual at midnight on the night of the full moon. As they completed the ritual, the ground shook and a howling wind swept through the town. Jenny could hear the sound of something screaming in the distance. And then it was gone. From that day on, the town of Pine Creek was quiet once again. The storm had passed, and the evil entity had been banished. But Jenny knew that she would never forget the terror she had experienced, and that the memory of that dark and stormy night would haunt her forever. Story number 13. Deep in the woods, there was an old abandoned mansion that had been left untouched for decades. Its once great beauty was now faded and covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Locals whispered about strange occurrences and mysterious noises emanating from the mansion at night, but no one had ever dared to investigate. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the mansion, determined to uncover its secrets. They arrived at the mansion just as the sun was setting, and as they made their way through the overgrown garden, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they entered the mansion, they were greeted by the musty smell of old wood and a sense of unease that seemed to grow with each step. The first floor was filled with antique furniture and old paintings, but the group quickly realized that something was off. The paintings seemed to follow their every move, and the furniture creaked as if it were alive. As they made their way to the second floor, the temperature dropped, and the air became thick with a sense of dread. The walls were covered in dark stains, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. Suddenly, they heard a scream coming from one of the rooms, and they all froze in fear. They cautiously approached the room and pushed the door open, only to find an empty room. As they turned to leave, they saw a figure in the corner of their eye. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, with long hair that seemed to glow in the darkness. She stared at them with lifeless eyes before disappearing into thin air. The group's fear turned into panic, and they ran back down the stairs, only to find that the mansion had transformed. The walls were now covered in rotting flesh, and the air was filled with the stench of death. They tried to escape, but the doors and windows were now locked. As they screamed for help, they heard laughter echoing through the halls. It was a voice they didn't recognize, filled with malice and delight. They soon realized that the mansion was alive, and it was feeding on their fear and terror. Days turned into weeks, and the group was still trapped in the mansion, slowly losing their minds as they were tormented by the entity that resided within its walls. They were never seen or heard from again, and the mansion continued to stand, a testament to the horror that lurked within its walls. From that day on, the mansion became known as the House of Horrors, and no one ever dared to enter it again. The legends of the mansion continued to spread, and it remained an eerie reminder of the darkness that can reside in the most unexpected of places. Story number 14. Once upon a time, in a small town nestled deep in the heart of the forest, there lived a family who had been cursed for generations. The curse began with a young girl who had been accused of witchcraft by her jealous neighbors. She was burned at the stake, and before she died, she placed a curse on her accusers and their descendants. The curse would cause them to suffer great tragedy and sorrow for all eternity. Over the years, the family grew in size and prosperity, but the curse remained. Strange things began to happen in the town: unexplained deaths, mysterious disappearances, and strange occurrences that left the townspeople uneasy. Many of the townspeople believed that the family was cursed and that their misfortune was a result of the curse. As time passed, the family grew increasingly reclusive, rarely venturing outside their massive mansion on the edge of town. The mansion was rumored to be haunted, and strange lights were often seen flickering in the windows at night. One summer evening, a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned mansion. They made their way through the overgrown gardens and climbed over the wrought iron gates that surrounded the property. As they entered the mansion, they were struck by the eerie silence that permeated the air. As they explored the mansion, they noticed that it seemed almost frozen in time. Cobwebs covered the furniture, and the air was thick with dust. As they made their way up to the second floor, they heard a strange noise coming from one of the rooms. It sounded like a child crying. The teenagers cautiously approached the room, and as they pushed open the door, they were greeted by a gruesome sight. A young girl was lying on the floor, her body contorted in pain. Her eyes were open, but she was not breathing. The room was filled with the stench of decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. Suddenly, the room began to shake, and the teenagers were thrown to the ground. They looked up in horror as the walls began to close in on them. They tried to run, but it was too late. The walls crushed them, and they were never seen again. The next day, the townspeople were horrified to discover that the teenagers had gone missing. A search party was organized, but no trace of them was ever found. From that day on, the mansion was shrouded in even greater mystery, and the townspeople began to believe that the curse had claimed its latest victims. Story number 15. In the small town of Millfield, nestled between the rolling hills of the countryside, there was an old antique shop that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The shop owner, Mrs. Jenkins, was an elderly woman with a wry smile and twinkling eyes. She had a fascination with dolls and had been collecting them for over 50 years. Her collection was vast, with dolls of all shapes, sizes, and materials, from delicate porcelain figurines to raggedy cloth dolls with wild hair. Despite the shop's somewhat dusty appearance and the occasional creaky floorboard, the locals loved to visit it, drawn in by the mystery and nostalgia of the antiques on display. But some people whispered that the dolls in the shop seemed to have a life of their own, and that there were rumors of strange happenings occurring after dark. One weekend, a young couple from the city decided to take a road trip to the countryside to escape the hustle and bustle of urban life. As they were driving down the winding road that led to Millfield, they stumbled upon the antique shop. They were immediately drawn to the old-fashioned charm of the place and decided to take a look inside. The shop was filled with all manner of knickknacks and curios, but what caught the woman's eye was a vintage porcelain doll with big blue eyes and curly blonde hair. It was dressed in an old-fashioned white lace dress and looked like it had been lovingly cared for over the years. The couple decided to purchase the doll as a souvenir of their trip, and Mrs. Jenkins wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in a small cardboard box. As they were leaving the shop, Mrs. Jenkins leaned in and whispered, "Be careful with that one. She's special." The couple brushed it off as a bit of shopkeeper's superstition and headed back to their hotel. That night, they placed the box with the doll on the nightstand and went to bed, exhausted from the day's adventure. In the middle of the night, the woman woke up to the sound of giggling. She opened her eyes and saw the box on the nightstand had been opened, and the doll was sitting upright, looking straight at her. Its blue eyes seemed to be shining in the darkness, and its curly blonde hair appeared to be gently waving in an unseen breeze. The woman rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just her imagination. But when she opened them again, the doll was still looking at her. She shook her partner awake, and they both sat up in bed, watching the doll in disbelief. Suddenly, the doll's head turned towards them, as if it had heard them talking. The couple froze, not daring to move a muscle. The doll's blue eyes seemed to bore into theirs, and they felt an overwhelming sense of unease. Just when they thought things couldn't get any weirder, the doll began to move. It lifted its arm and pointed at the couple, its painted lips twisting into a sinister grin. The couple screamed in terror and jumped out of bed, grabbing their things and running out of the hotel room. They drove away from the hotel as fast as they could, not daring to look back. But as they were driving down the winding road, they saw the doll sitting on the side of the road, its head turned to watch them go. From that day on, the couple experienced strange occurrences in their apartment. They would hear the sound of giggling coming from the doll's box, and objects would move on their own. The woman even claimed to have seen the doll's blue eyes following her around the room. After weeks of enduring the doll's terrifying presence, the couple decided they couldn't take it anymore. They returned to the antique shop in Millfield and told Mrs. Jenkins about their experience with the doll. Mrs. Jenkins listened carefully, nodding her head with understanding. She then explained that the doll they had purchased was known as Annabelle, and that it had been possessed by the spirit of a young girl who had died tragically in a car accident many years ago. Mrs. Jenkins had been aware of the doll's dark past but had never shared it with anyone. Feeling a sense of responsibility for what had happened, Mrs. Jenkins took the doll back and locked it away in a special cabinet in the back of the shop. She knew that Annabelle was not to be taken lightly, and that her dark powers needed to be contained. The couple left the shop feeling relieved, but they never forgot the horror they had experienced with Annabelle. And while the doll remained locked away in the antique shop, there were still reports of strange happenings and sightings of the doll in the town of Millfield. Legend has it that Annabelle still haunts the antique shop, waiting for her next unsuspecting victim to come along and fall under her spell. And to this day, Mrs. Jenkins keeps a watchful eye on her collection of dolls, knowing that there may be others like Annabelle lurking among them.